The protest began on a sweltering afternoon outside the county courthouse. Hundreds of people gathered on the wide steps, their voices rising in unison as they demanded accountability for recent cases of police misconduct. Marcus Johnson stood at the front of the crowd, his presence commanding attention despite his deliberately calm demeanor. His suit jacket was folded over his arm, his white shirt crisp despite the heat, and his hands gripped a sign that read, "Justice knows no color." Around him, the crowd's energy swelled as more protesters arrived, their numbers growing by the minute. Several yards away, Officer John Miller sat in his patrol car, the air conditioning blasting against the summer heat. His partner, Officer Steve Roberts, leaned against the open passenger window, wiping sweat from his forehead. Miller's jaw clenched as he watched the protesters through mirrored sunglasses. "Look at them," Miller said, his knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. "Acting like they own the place. Someone needs to show them their place." Roberts nodded, a slight smirk playing across his features. "Well, they're getting pretty rowdy. Wouldn't take much to justify crowd control measures." He tapped the car door rhythmically. "Chief gave us discretion to maintain order." The protesters' chants grew louder, "No justice, no peace." The sound echoed off the courthouse walls, creating a thunderous effect that seemed to personally offend Miller. He watched as Marcus raised his sign higher, leading a new chant that spread through the crowd like wildfire. Miller threw his car door open, the metal creaking under the force. He adjusted his utility belt as he emerged, his hand hovering near his baton. Roberts followed, maintaining a slight distance but ready to back his partner up. The crowd's energy shifted as the officers approached, some protesters stepping back while others pressed forward, phones raised to record what was happening. "Disperse immediately," Miller shouted, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd wielded for 15 years on the force. But Marcus stood his ground, maintaining his dignified posture while continuing to hold his sign high. The next few moments unfolded with brutal efficiency. Miller advanced, shoving people aside as he made his way toward Marcus. The crowd's chants turned to shouts of warning and protest. Marcus turned to face the officer, his expression neutral but resolute. Without warning, Miller's hand shot out, grabbing Marcus's shirt collar. The sign clattered to the ground. "I said disperse," Miller growled, his face inches from Marcus's. What happened next was captured by dozens of cell phones. Miller's baton swung in a sharp arc, connecting with Marcus's ribs. As Marcus doubled over, Miller delivered another blow, this time to his back. The crowd erupted in screams and shouts, but Miller seemed possessed by a cold rage, landing blow after blow until Marcus collapsed on the courthouse steps. Roberts stood back, making no move to intervene as his partner continued the assault. The crowd surged forward then retreated, caught between the instinct to help and the fear of meeting the same fate. Someone in the crowd shouted, "He's a federal judge," but the words were lost in the chaos. The emergency room at City General Hospital buzzed with tense activity. Angela Johnson paced the sterile hallway, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. Her normally composed demeanor had cracked, revealing the raw fear underneath. Every time the double doors swung open, she stopped, hoping for news about Marcus's condition. "Mrs. Johnson," a nurse called out, clipboard in hand. "Your husband is stable. He has 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and extensive bruising, but there's no internal bleeding." Angela's hands trembled as she signed the medical forms. "This shouldn't have happened," she whispered, more to herself than the nurse. "He spent his entire career fighting against this kind of violence, and now..." Her voice trailed off as she watched the news playing on the waiting room television. The footage was everywhere. Shaky cell phone videos showed the attack from multiple angles, each more damning than the last. Local news stations had broken into regular programming to show the incident on repeat. The marquee at the bottom of the screen read, "Federal judge brutally attacked by police officer during peaceful protest." Social media exploded with the story. Hashtag Justice for Judge Johnson began trending within hours. Twitter feeds filled with screenshots of the attack, alongside Marcus's professional headshot from the federal courthouse website. The contrast between the dignified portrait and the images of him bloodied on the courthouse steps created a powerful narrative that spread rapidly across platforms. In a small office downtown, Sarah Chen, a civil rights attorney, watched the footage for the 10th time. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since the incident. As the leader of the local activist organization, Equal Justice Initiative, she recognized this as a pivotal moment. She began organizing an emergency response team, coordinating with other civil rights organizations across the state. "We need to mobilize immediately," Sarah told her team during an impromptu meeting. "This isn't just another case of police brutality. This is a federal judge who's dedicated his life to civil rights being attacked by the very system he's tried to reform." The responses poured in from across the country. Civil rights leaders announced they were flying in to show support. Law professors from prestigious universities offered to file amicus briefs. Former clerks who had worked with Marcus shared stories of his dedication to justice and equality. Meanwhile, Angela sat beside Marcus's hospital bed, holding his hand as he drifted in and out of consciousness. Her phone continuously buzzed with messages of support, but she couldn't bring herself to read them. The reality of what happened kept replaying in her mind. Her husband, a respected federal judge with 3 decades of service to the justice system, beaten like a criminal on the steps of the very courthouse where he worked. "We always knew something like this could happen," she said softly to Marcus's sleeping form. "But you never stopped fighting." She thought about all the times he'd come home late from the courthouse, working on cases involving police misconduct and civil rights violations. How many times had he told her, "If we don't stand up, who will?" Outside the hospital, a crowd began to gather. People held candles and signs supporting Judge Johnson. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching into the darkening sky. Social media influencers live-streamed from the scene, sharing updates with millions of followers. The incident had become more than just another case of police brutality. It had become a symbol of the broken system Marcus had spent his life trying to fix. The conference room of the federal courthouse felt unusually crowded 3 days after the incident. Marcus, still visibly bruised but sitting straight-backed in his chair, faced a group of his colleagues and prominent civil rights activists. Chief Judge Patricia Montgomery, a longtime friend and mentor, sat at the head of the table, her expression grave. "This isn't just about you anymore, Marcus," Judge Montgomery said, sliding a thick folder across the polished mahogany table. "We've compiled reports of similar incidents in our district over the past 5 years. Officer Miller's name appears multiple times, but none of the complaints stuck." The room fell silent as Marcus opened the folder. Medical reports, witness statements, and dismissed complaints painted a clear picture of a pattern of behavior. Each case had been quietly settled or dismissed, buried under bureaucratic paperwork and police union pressure. "The department's Internal Affairs Division has a history of protecting him," added Judge Robert Chen, adjusting his glasses. "But this time it's different. They can't sweep a federal judge under the rug." Meanwhile, across town at the police precinct, Officer John Miller sat in Captain Richard's office, his posture rigid. The captain paced behind his desk, occasionally glancing at the TV mounted on the wall, which continued to play footage of the incident. "Keep your mouth shut," Captain Richards advised, stopping to face Miller. "No statements to the press, no social media posts, nothing. The union lawyer will handle everything." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Remember, you were maintaining order during an increasingly volatile situation. Stick to that story." Miller nodded, but his usual confidence had cracked. His fellow officers had been avoiding eye contact in the hallways, and his partner had requested a transfer. The thin blue line that had always protected him seemed to be wavering. In their home study, Angela Johnson sat surrounded by printed documents and open laptop screens. She'd taken leave from her position as a hospital administrator to focus on investigating Miller's history. Her medical training had taught her to be methodical, and she approached this task with the same precision. "Look at this," she said to Sarah Chen, who had come to review their findings. Angela pointed to a pattern in the complaints against Miller. "He consistently targets African American men, particularly those in positions of authority. There's a psychological profile here." Sarah nodded, taking notes. "And here's something interesting," she added, pulling up a news article from 8 years ago. Miller was involved in a similar incident with a prominent black businessman. The case was settled quietly, and the records were sealed. Angela's hands clenched into fists. They knew. They knew what kind of officer he was, and they kept him on the force. She stood up, walking to the window where she could see the small group of reporters still camped outside their house. Marcus always said the system protects its own. He just never thought he'd become proof of that. The investigation continued late into the night. Angela compiled a timeline of Miller's career, noting every complaint, every incident, every sign that had been ignored. She thought about Marcus, who even now was preparing to return to work, refusing to let this incident define him. His determination had always inspired her, but now it terrified her too. "We need to make sure this time is different," Angela told Sarah as they wrapped up their research. "Not just for Marcus, but for everyone who couldn't fight back." Sarah Chen's law office became a war room in the weeks following the incident. Case files and legal precedents covered every available surface. Marcus sat across from her desk, his posture still slightly rigid from his healing ribs, as they prepared their legal strategy. "Tell me again exactly what happened before he approached you," Sarah said, her recorder running. She'd heard the story multiple times, but each retelling revealed new details that could be crucial to their case. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "I was leading the chant for police accountability. Nothing provocative, nothing threatening. I saw him watching from his patrol car for about 20 minutes before he approached. His body language was aggressive from the moment he stepped out." Sarah nodded, making notes. "Your position as a federal judge adds another layer to this case. He didn't just assault a civilian, he attacked a member of the federal judiciary during a constitutionally protected protest." As they discussed strategy, Sarah found herself increasingly moved by Marcus's composure. Despite everything, he spoke without bitterness, focusing instead on systematic change. His approach to justice, even when he was the victim, remained measured and strategic. Across town, Officer Miller sat alone in a back booth at O'Malley's bar, a longtime police hangout. His usual drinking companions were noticeably absent. The few officers who entered gave him a wide berth, their avoidance speaking volumes. The thin blue line was fracturing, and Miller felt the isolation acutely. Officer Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran, finally approached his table. "John, things are getting complicated. The union's worried about the optics. Some officers are saying we shouldn't back you on this one." Miller's hand tightened around his glass. "I was doing my job. The crowd was getting out of control." "The videos show something different," Rodriguez replied, his voice low. "And this isn't just any protester. He's a federal judge with a spotless reputation. The department can't protect you like before." Later that week, Marcus stood at a podium in the community center, addressing a packed room of activists, community leaders, and citizens. The bruises on his face had faded to yellow, but his presence was more powerful than ever. "What happened to me isn't unique," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "What's unique is that I have the platform to fight back. I wear this robe not just as a symbol of authority, but as a responsibility to ensure justice for everyone who has faced similar violence without the means to seek redress." The crowd hung on his every word. Among them sat dozens of victims of police brutality who had never seen justice. Marcus's story had given them hope, a chance to believe that the system could be held accountable. "This isn't about one officer or one incident," Marcus continued. "This is about a system that enables and protects those who abuse their power. Change doesn't come from silence. It comes from standing up, speaking out, and demanding better." As he spoke, social media lit up with his words. #JudgeForJustice started trending, alongside clips of his speech. The movement was growing, transcending the initial incident to become something larger, a rallying cry for systematic change. The federal courthouse was packed for the first hearing. Security was tight, with officers from a neighboring jurisdiction handling crowd control, a deliberate choice to avoid any conflict of interest. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable as Sarah Chen rose to present their case. Miller sat at the defense table, his police uniform replaced by a navy suit that seemed to hang loosely on his frame. His union-appointed attorney, James Morrison, maintained a confident facade, but his constant shuffling of papers betrayed his nervousness. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice clear and steady, "we will demonstrate that Officer Miller's attack on Judge Johnson was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a pattern of racially motivated violence that has been systematically ignored by his department." She proceeded to present a devastating timeline. Security footage from previous incidents. Testimony from other victims who had never received justice. Internal affairs reports that had been buried. With each piece of evidence, Miller seemed to shrink further into his chair. Furthermore, Sarah continued, pulling out a particularly damning piece of evidence. Officer Miller's body camera footage from the 6 months preceding this incident shows a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior. In traffic stops alone, he was 4 times more likely to use force against African American citizens than any other demographic. The evidence was methodical, irrefutable. Even Miller's staunchest supporters in the police department began to distance themselves. During breaks, he sat alone in the courthouse corridors, avoided by both his colleagues and the general public. The weight of his actions, now exposed to public scrutiny, seemed to physically bear down on him. That evening, in the privacy of their home, Marcus finally allowed himself to show the vulnerability he'd been hiding. Angela found him in his study, staring at family photos on the wall. "I keep thinking about our son," Marcus said quietly, touching a picture of their teenage boy. "He's watching all of this unfold. What message does it send him about his place in this world?" Angela sat beside him, taking his hand. "It shows him that his father is willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult." Marcus nodded slowly. "You know, throughout my career, I've sat on that bench and made decisions that affected people's lives. I've always tried to be fair, to see both sides. But now, being on this side of the system..." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "It's different when you're the one seeking justice instead of dispensing it." The strain of the past weeks showed in his face. The physical wounds were healing, but the psychological impact lingered. Every time he walked into a courthouse, every time he saw a police car, there was a moment of tension, a flash of memory. "Sarah thinks we have a strong case," he continued. "But this isn't just about winning in court. It's about changing the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. How many others have faced what I faced, but without the resources or platform to fight back?" Angela squeezed his hand. "That's why we keep fighting. Not just for us, but for all of them too." The weight of responsibility was heavy, but Marcus had carried heavy burdens before. Tomorrow, he would return to the courthouse, face his attacker, and continue the fight for justice. But tonight, in the quiet of his study, he allowed himself to feel the full impact of what they were undertaking. The second hearing brought a revelation that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Sarah Chin stood before the judge, holding a sealed file that had taken weeks of legal maneuvering to obtain. "Your Honor, we've uncovered evidence of a previous incident from Officer Miller's time at his former precinct in Atlanta," Sarah announced, her voice steady. In 2015, Miller was involved in the violent arrest of Dr. James Thompson, a prominent African-American surgeon. The case was settled out of court, and all records were sealed under a confidentiality agreement. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Miller's attorney jumped to his feet, objecting, but the judge overruled him. Sarah continued, methodically laying out the parallels between the Thompson case and Marcus's assault. The pattern was undeniable. Both victims were successful African-American professionals, both had been attacked during nonviolent encounters, and both incidents had involved excessive force. Outside the courthouse, the community's response was immediate and powerful. Angela found herself at the center of a growing movement. She stood before a crowd of thousands, sharing her family's story for the first time publicly. "My husband has spent his life upholding the law," she said, her voice carrying across the gathered protesters. "But 15 years ago, I lost my brother to police violence. The officer responsible was never held accountable. When I saw Marcus lying on those courthouse steps, bleeding, all I could think was, not again. Not this time." The crowd responded with a mix of anger and solidarity. Signs bearing Marcus's image and the words, "No more silence," filled the plaza. Social media amplified the message, with hashtags trending nationwide. The case had become a symbol of the broader struggle for police accountability. Meanwhile, Miller's world continued to crumble. In the police department break room, conversations stopped when he entered. His locker was defaced with the word liability in permanent marker. Even officers who had once covered for him now treated him like a pariah. Alone in his apartment that evening, Miller sat with a glass of whiskey, watching news coverage of the protests. His phone buzzed with a message from his sister, "Mom's asking why you won't return her calls. She's seen the videos, John. We all have." For the first time, Miller began to question everything he'd believed about himself. The justifications that had seemed so solid before, maintaining order, asserting authority, controlling situations, now felt hollow. He thought about Dr. Thompson in Atlanta, about Marcus Johnson, about all the others. Had they all been threats that needed controlling, or had he been the threat all along? His union representative had stopped taking his calls. The department had placed him on indefinite administrative leave. His bank account was draining from legal fees, and the union's legal support was wavering. The system that had protected him for so long was now treating him as toxic. In a moment of clarity, or perhaps desperation, Miller opened his laptop and began typing. Hours later, he had written a full account of not just the incident with Marcus, but every time he'd crossed the line, every report he'd falsified, every colleague who'd helped cover it up. His finger hovered over the send button, the document addressed to the department's Internal Affairs Division. As dawn broke, Miller stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing himself. The weight of his actions, the lives he'd impacted, the system he'd been part of, it all came crashing down. But was this realization genuine remorse, or just fear of consequences? The courthouse had become the epicenter of a national conversation. News trucks lined the street, and reporters camped out day and night. Marcus's story had evolved beyond a single incident of police brutality. It had become a testament to the broader struggle for justice and accountability. Inside his chambers, Marcus reviewed case files from other victims who had reached out since his attack. Each story echoed his own: the sudden escalation, the excessive force, the systemic protection of officers involved. His personal injury had transformed into a mission. Local civil rights organizations had begun using his case as a template for other lawsuits against police departments across the country. "Your testimony is changing minds," Sarah told him during their preparation session. "People who normally defend police actions automatically are starting to question their assumptions. It's different when they see someone of your stature, with your credentials, speaking about experiencing this kind of violence firsthand." But with increased visibility came increased risk. Sarah's office had received multiple threatening letters. Security cameras caught people photographing her house at night. The tension reached a breaking point when her car's brake lines were found cut in the courthouse parking garage. "They're getting desperate," Sarah said during an emergency meeting with Marcus and his security team. Miller's supporters within the department know this case could expose more than just one officer's actions. It could unravel years of covered-up misconduct. Miller, meanwhile, had grown increasingly erratic. His neighbors reported hearing him arguing with himself late at night. He'd been spotted drinking heavily at bars, getting into confrontations with strangers who recognized him. His lawyer had to physically restrain him from approaching reporters outside the courthouse. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Marcus was leaving the courthouse through a side entrance, his security detail slightly delayed by a suspicious package investigation at the main door. Miller appeared seemingly from nowhere, his suit wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. "You don't understand," Miller called out, his voice trembling. "I was doing my job. Maintaining order. That's what they trained us to do. That's what they wanted us to do." Marcus turned to face him, security guards rushing to intervene. But Marcus held up his hand, stopping them. "Who are they, Officer Miller? The department? The system? Or is it the voice in your head that tells you some people deserve less dignity than others?" Miller's face contorted. "You people always play the victim. I was protecting the community." "Which community?" Marcus asked, his voice level but powerful. "The one you swore to serve and protect, or the one you decided was worthy of protection? I've spent 30 years in that courthouse, upholding the law for everyone. Not just people who look like me, not just people who look like you, everyone. That's what justice means." The confrontation lasted only minutes, but videos of it spread rapidly across social media. Marcus's composed response to Miller's aggression, his unwavering dignity in the face of hatred, resonated with millions. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been starker, one representing the abuse of power, the other embodying the pursuit of justice. Later that day, in Sarah's office, Marcus finally allowed himself to process the encounter. "He truly believes he's the victim here," he said quietly. "That's what makes this system so dangerous. It doesn't just protect the abusers, it convinces them they're right." The day before the final hearing, tension gripped the city. Police barricades surrounded the courthouse, and the National Guard had been placed on standby. The case had become a flashpoint, drawing supporters and protesters from across the country. Inside Sarah's office, her team conducted final preparations. Boxes of evidence lined the walls, each containing pieces of the puzzle they'd spent months assembling. Sarah stood before a whiteboard covered in timeline details, witness statements, and legal precedents. Tomorrow isn't just about one incident, she told her team. It's about exposing a system that's failed consistently and deliberately. We're not just trying Miller, we're putting the entire structure on trial. Marcus sat at the conference table, reviewing his testimony one last time. The bruises had long since faded, but the purpose of his fight had only grown stronger. Angela sat beside him, organizing the files of other victims who had come forward, their stories forming a devastating pattern of abuse and cover-ups. Across town, Miller's defense team scrambled to handle an unexpected crisis. Their client had become increasingly unstable, missing preparation sessions and sending rambling, late-night emails to the department brass. His lawyer, Morrison, had to convince the judge that Miller was competent to stand trial. Then, at 11:47 p.m., everything changed. A junior member of Sarah's team burst into the office, laptop in hand. "You need to see this," she said, breathless. "It just got uploaded to a police accountability website." The video began playing on the conference room screen. The footage, apparently from a body camera, showed Miller and several other officers at a scene from 2 years ago. The audio was clear, capturing conversations never meant to be heard. Miller and his colleagues discussed their system for handling incidents involving minorities, including how to modify reports and disable body cameras at crucial moments. "Where did this come from?" Sarah demanded, already thinking about authentication and chain of custody. "Anonymous upload," the junior lawyer replied. "But it's not just one video. There are dozens, spanning 5 years. Internal emails too. Someone inside the department dumped everything." The team worked through the night, verifying the footage, cross-referencing incidents, building a comprehensive narrative. The videos revealed a pattern far more extensive than they'd initially believed. Miller wasn't an outlier, he was part of an informal but organized system of discrimination and cover-ups. By dawn, Sarah had restructured their entire presentation. This wasn't just about Miller's attack on Marcus anymore. The videos provided context, showing how the assault on a federal judge was the inevitable result of years of unchecked abuse and institutional protection. "This changes everything," Sarah told Marcus as they prepared to leave for court. "Miller's not just on trial for attacking you. He's the key to exposing everything they've tried to hide." The courthouse steps were already crowded when they arrived. News of the video leak had spread, and the atmosphere was electric. Reporters shouted questions, photographers' cameras clicked rapidly, and the crowd parted like water as Marcus and his team made their way inside. In the courthouse bathroom, Miller splashed water on his face, his hands shaking. He knew those videos. He remembered those conversations. The system that had protected him for so long was about to be exposed, and he was the crack through which the light would shine. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as Sarah loaded the first video. The judge, an experienced jurist who had seen countless cases of police misconduct, leaned forward slightly in his chair. The video's timestamp showed a clear date from 2 years ago, the image quality sharp and undeniable. Miller's voice filled the courtroom, just like we discussed. "These situations require special handling. The cameras have a funny way of malfunctioning when we need them to." The footage showed him demonstrating to a rookie officer how to temporarily disable the recording function without leaving evidence of tampering. Sarah methodically presented video after video, each more damning than the last. The systematic nature of the misconduct became clear: coordinated report alterations, witness intimidation, evidence manipulation. Miller appeared in many of them, not just as a participant but as an instructor, teaching younger officers the unwritten rules of their corrupt system. Miller sat at the defense table, his face ashen. His attorney attempted multiple objections, but the judge overruled each one. The videos had been authenticated by technical experts overnight, and their admission into evidence was irreversible. As each new clip played, Miller seemed to physically shrink in his chair. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steady, "these videos demonstrate that the attack on Judge Johnson wasn't an isolated incident of one officer losing control. It was the product of a carefully maintained system of discrimination and abuse. Officer Miller's assault on Judge Johnson happened because he believed he was untouchable, protected by this very system." During a brief recess, Marcus sat in a side room with Angela, both processing the morning's revelations. "All those years," Angela whispered, "all those cases we heard about, all those families who never got justice, they were right. The system wasn't just failing them. It was actively working against them. Marcus nodded slowly. That's why this has to end here. Not just Miller's career, but the entire structure that enabled him. When court resumed, Miller's defense attorney attempted damage control. He argued that the videos were taken out of context, that they represented standard police procedures for maintaining order in difficult situations. But his words rang hollow against the clear evidence of systematic abuse. Miller, seeming to realize the futility of his position, suddenly stood up. "I want to speak," he announced, ignoring his attorney's attempts to silence him. The judge warned him about his right to remain silent, but Miller pressed on. "Everything in those videos is true," he said, his voice shaking. "We did it because we could. Because nobody ever stopped us. Because the system." He paused, looking around the courtroom, "Because the system taught us we were right." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. His attorney put his head in his hands. Sarah remained still, watching as years of practiced denial crumbled under the weight of truth. The judge called for order, his gavel echoing through the stunned courtroom. As the noise settled, he announced he would review all evidence overnight before delivering his verdict the next morning. Marcus caught Miller's eye as deputies led him out. For the first time, he saw something different in his attacker's face, not defiance, not hatred, but the dawning realization of what he had been part of. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity on verdict day. The judge entered, his expression grave as he took his seat. The silence was absolute as he began to speak. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have never seen such clear evidence of not just individual misconduct, but systematic corruption," he began. "Officer John Miller, please rise." Miller stood, trembling slightly. "This court finds you guilty of assault, abuse of power, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. You are sentenced to 15 years in federal prison." The judge paused, then continued, "However, this case has revealed something far more disturbing than one officer's crimes. Therefore, I am ordering a federal investigation into the entire department, with all evidence to be turned over to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division." The courtroom erupted in celebration, but the victory was quickly tempered by what came next. Sarah's phone buzzed with an urgent message. A source within the department had just sent her encrypted files revealing an even darker truth. Assistant Chief Michael Davidson, Miller's longtime mentor, had been orchestrating a complex network of evidence suppression for years. Davidson hadn't just protected officers like Miller, he'd actively recruited them, identifying those most likely to follow his illegal directives. He had built a shadow system within the department, designed to maintain what he called aggressive order maintenance in minority communities. The revelation sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Davidson was arrested that evening, trying to board a flight to Mexico. His arrest led to a cascade of confessions from other officers, each trying to secure leniency by exposing the full scope of the conspiracy. 2 weeks later, Marcus stood at a podium in the community center where he'd first spoken about his attack. The room was filled with families who had lost loved ones to police violence, activists who had fought for years without success, and journalists from across the country. "Today, we've achieved something unprecedented," Marcus began. "Not just justice for one incident, but the exposure of a system that has perpetuated injustice for generations. The real work begins now." He gestured to Sarah and a team of civil rights attorneys who had joined forces to create a new advocacy organization dedicated to police reform. Miller, from his prison cell, had begun cooperating with investigators, providing detailed information about every case of misconduct he'd witnessed or participated in. His testimony would eventually lead to dozens of convictions and the overturning of hundreds of wrongful arrests. Angela stood beside Marcus at the podium, their hands clasped together. "This victory belongs to everyone who ever spoke up and wasn't heard," she said. "To every family who demanded justice and was denied. To every community that lived in fear of those sworn to protect them." The ceremony ended with the announcement of the Marcus Johnson Justice Initiative, a nationwide program to combat police misconduct and support victims of law enforcement abuse. The program would provide legal assistance, advocacy training, and support for communities affected by police violence. As Marcus looked out over the crowd, he saw not just supporters celebrating a victory, but warriors preparing for the larger battle ahead. The system hadn't been completely dismantled, but for the first time in decades, its foundations had been shaken. Miller's case became a landmark in police reform, cited in law schools and police academies as a turning point in accountability. But for Marcus and Angela, it was more than that. It was proof that justice, while slow and difficult, was possible. The truth, once exposed, could not be buried again.